Aileen Wuornos, America's first female serial killer. Convicted of 7 murders, she became one of the most infamous figures in true crime history.
Did you kill those 7 men?
I killed them, I didn't murder them.
On October 8, 2002, sitting in her death row cell, she knew her time was running out. Her execution was 24 hours away, but Aileen wasn't afraid. For her, death was freedom, a release from a life filled with pain and violence. How did she end up here? Branded the damsel of death, Aileen claimed her victims were dangerous men, but the court saw her as a predator. Alone in her cell, she waited for what she called her freedom, a life on the edge. Aileen Wuornos' life was anything but ordinary. Born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen faced challenges from the very beginning. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted criminal serving time for child-related offenses and had no involvement in her life. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, abandoned Aileen and her brother Keith when Aileen was just a toddler, leaving them in the care of their grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. The environment in her grandparents' home was far from nurturing. Aileen later claimed she was physically and emotionally abused by her grandfather, a man she described as controlling and cold. Her grandmother, though present, reportedly struggled with alcoholism and was unable to provide the stability Aileen needed. By the age of 11, Aileen's life had taken a darker turn. She began engaging in some very dangerous and risky behavior, seeking attention and acceptance in any way she could. At just 14 years old, Aileen became pregnant, reportedly the result of an assault.
She was probably 6 months pregnant before the grandparents learned of what had happened.
Her grandparents sent her to a home for unwed mothers, where she gave birth to a baby boy who was quickly placed for adoption. Soon after, her grandmother passed away, and her grandfather forced her out of the house. Homeless and completely alone, Aileen turned to hitchhiking and survival on the streets. For the next several years, Aileen moved from place to place, taking odd jobs and relying on the kindness, or exploitation, of strangers. By the late 1970s, she had married a much older man, Louis Gratz-Fell, a yacht club president.
He was pretty well off, and perhaps it was her best chance of some kind of normal life because he was spending money on her.
The marriage, however, was short-lived. Fell accused her of physical violence, and the relationship ended in annulment within weeks. Aileen continued her fugitive lifestyle, which often brought her into conflict with the law for offenses like theft, forgery, and disorderly conduct. By the late 1980s, Aileen had settled in Florida, where she hoped to find stability, but instead found herself caught in a downward spiral. The series of events that would make her infamous began in November 1989 with the disappearance of 51-year-old Richard Mallory, an electronics store owner. According to Aileen, she met Mallory while hitchhiking, and their encounter turned violent. She claimed he assaulted her, and in what she described as self-defense, she shot him multiple times. His body was later discovered in a wooded area, and police recovered several of his personal belongings near the scene. This first killing set off a chain of murders that would eventually label her as America's first female serial killer. In June 1990, the body of David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker from Winter Garden, was discovered along State Road 19. He had been shot 6 times and left stripped of his clothing. The details surrounding his death raised unsettling questions about their encounter, painting a dark picture of the circumstances. Just 2 weeks later, Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, was found dead in Pasco County. He had been shot 9 times, a level of violence that shocked investigators and underscored the brutality of the crime. His body, abandoned on a dirt road, pointed to a violent escalation in the killings. Another mysterious case was that of Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman who vanished in June 1990 while driving from Florida to Arkansas. His car was later discovered abandoned, bearing Aileen's fingerprints on the door handle. However, unlike the other victims, Seams's body was never recovered, leaving a haunting gap in the story and unanswered questions about his fate. In July 1990, Troy Burris, a 50-year-old sausage delivery driver from Ocala, Florida, was reported missing. Days later, his body was found in a wooded area. Burris had been shot twice, and investigators noted troubling similarities to the earlier murders. It was around this time that the repeated pattern of violence solidified their suspicions of a serial killer at work. By September 1990, the case took an even darker turn, with the murder of Charles Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former police chief. His fully clothed body was discovered with 6 gunshot wounds. The fact that Humphreys had a law enforcement background added complexity to the case, raising questions about whether his profession had made him a target or if it was a tragic coincidence. The final known victim in this deadly spree was Walter Jano Antonio, a 62-year-old man whose body was found in November 1990 in a remote area of Dixie County. Antonio had been shot 4 times and left near a logging road. Investigators later discovered his abandoned car, which tied his death to the growing list of victims linked to Wuornos. By late 1990, authorities began piecing together the evidence. Adeleen's use of the victims' cars, their stolen belongings, and the scattered trail of fingerprints made it clear they were dealing with one suspect. Investigators also turned their attention to Adeleen's partner at the time, Tyria Moore, who became a key figure in the case. The couple had shared a volatile relationship, with Tyria later cooperating with police to build the case against Aileen. In January 1991, Aileen was arrested at a bar in Port Orange, Florida, on an outstanding warrant. Police used Moore to secure a confession, recording phone calls in which she persuaded Aileen to admit to the killings. Aileen, determined to protect Tyria, confessed and claimed full responsibility, stating that her partner had no involvement in the murders. Aileen Wuornos' trial began in January 1992 and quickly became a media spectacle. The prosecution painted her as a manipulative predator who killed for financial gain, citing her use of the victims' credit cards and stolen property. The defense argued that she acted in self-defense, citing her history of abuse and claims that the men had threatened her. Richard Mallory's criminal record, which included a previous conviction for crimes of a sexual nature, was introduced as evidence to support Aileen's claims. However, this detail did little to sway the jury. In January 1992, Aileen was convicted of Mallory's murder and sentenced to death. She later pleaded guilty to the other 6 killings, receiving additional death sentences for each. The countdown begins. After spending exactly 10 years and 9 months on death row at the Florida State Prison, Aileen Wuornos spent her final night in silence. Her execution was scheduled for the next day, and after all these years, the end was finally here. Although Aileen had often said she wasn't afraid of dying, she even said she saw it as freedom, a way to escape the pain and rejection that had defined her life right from when she was born into this world. But as the hours passed, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. By October 8, 2002, Aileen had accepted her fate. Her morning started like any other. Scrambled eggs, toast, and milk were handed through the slot in her cell door. But this wasn't just another day. This was her last. For years, she had accused guards of tampering with her food, but now none of it mattered. Her focus was on what was coming next. By noon, her final appeals were denied. A Tampa attorney and an Ohio-based advocacy group had argued that her mental state needed reassessment, but Aileen had already made it clear that she didn't want to fight anymore. Earlier that year, she had requested a fast-tracked execution, explaining that she was done waiting and ready for it all to end. This decision raised questions about her mental health. Many wondered if she was making a rational choice or if it reflected deeper instability. In September, her attorney, Rag Singhal, raised concerns about her psychological state, prompting Florida Governor Jeb Bush to temporarily delay the execution for evaluations. However, psychiatrists concluded that Aileen fully understood her decision and the consequences of her actions. State Attorney John Tanner confirmed that her decision was deliberate and calculated. Aileen spent her final hours mostly alone. She briefly interacted with her legal team and prison staff, but avoided unnecessary conversations. Over the years, her statements have been unpredictable. One minute she's this calm and reflective individual, and the next minute she turns into this angry and violent individual filled with all types of accusations. She even alleged that prison officials were conspiring to silence her, which also drew the attention of the public to her case and the things she was going through. But one thing remained consistent with Aileen. To the very end, she relentlessly stood by her claim that the killings were acts of self-defense, insisting that her victims had threatened and been inappropriate with her. But the courts also consistently rejected her version of events. To most people, she was seen as a predator who preyed on innocent people. But to her and her sympathizers, she was simply a survivor in a cruel world. Her final interview. That same afternoon of October 8, 2002, Aileen Wuornos sat down for her last interview with filmmaker Nick Broomfield. It was part of his documentary, Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. This was Aileen's final opportunity to let the world know her final thoughts. On the other hand, this documentary offered the viewers one final glimpse into the mind of a woman whose life had been shaped by violence, controversy, and pain. The setting was stark and unadorned, reflecting the gravity of the moment. Dressed in her orange prison uniform, her upbeat tone seemed out of place, as though she was trying to deflect the weight of her circumstances. When asked about life in prison, Aileen described it as tolerable, but full of a lot of challenges, especially for her. She acknowledged the stigma of her crimes, saying that not all staff treated her fairly because of her reputation as a serial killer. She admitted she had no friends and preferred to keep to herself, avoiding interactions with others. According to her, her days followed a repetitive routine of watching TV, reading the Bible, and writing letters to her childhood friend, Dawn Botkins, one of the few people who had stayed in her life. Aileen spoke candidly about how she spent her time reflecting on her past. She described revisiting painful memories from her upbringing and preparing herself emotionally for her execution. She believed it was important to release her emotions beforehand so she wouldn't break down during the final moments. Her calm demeanor suggested she had finally given in to her fate and wanted to face it without showing vulnerability. As the interview progressed, Aileen's tone shifted and frustration bubbled to the surface. She recounted what she saw as mistreatment in prison, claiming the staff monitored her constantly and subjected her to psychological and physical torment. She alleged that guards tampered with her food and even used harmful tactics to manipulate her mental state. Her accusations extended beyond the prison walls. Aileen insisted that law enforcement had knowingly allowed her crimes to continue after her first murder. She believed this was part of a deliberate effort to frame her as a serial killer for public spectacle and profit. To her, society and the justice system had exploited her life for entertainment, turning her pain into a commodity just for their consumption. By the end of the interview, Aileen's anger had given way to a chilling calm. She addressed the camera directly, expressing her disdain for the world she believed had betrayed her. Her closing words were a pointed condemnation of the system she felt had failed her, which captured the anger and defiance that defined her life. Later after the interview, Broomfield described the interview as a haunting final chapter in Aileen's story. Her words forced viewers to grapple with the complexity of her life, a story where pain and survival were deeply intertwined. The quiet hours leading up to execution. As the day wound down, Aileen Wuornos was done with her now iconic interview, and she returned to her cell on Florida's death row. The space was small and suffocating, but she appeared unusually composed. According to the officers, the outbursts and unpredictable behavior that had defined much of her time in prison were absent. In their place was a quiet acceptance. Alone, she reflected on the choices and events that had led her to this point and what was to come. However, there were some inconsistencies in Aileen's rationale behind the killing spree. For years, Aileen had claimed that the men she killed had assaulted or threatened her, insisting the murders were acts of self-defense. However, over time, her story shifted. She later admitted to harboring a deep hatred for people and acknowledged the violent nature that drove her actions. This clear admission painted a chilling picture of a woman shaped by pain and anger. By this stage, death no longer seemed like something to fear. For Aileen, it had become an escape from the isolation and mental strain of life on death row. Yet, even as she came to terms with the inevitable, she continued to voice frustration about her treatment in prison. She described strip searches, constant banging on her cell door, intrusive window checks, and other indignities that she believed were meant to dehumanize her. Her accusations extended to specific instances of cruelty. She alleged that some guards mocked her openly, their actions filled with malice. Her attorney supported her grievances, stating that Aileen wasn't seeking special privileges, but simply wanted to be treated with basic dignity during her final days. Unlike others on death row, Aileen faced her final hours alone. She had no visitors, made no last-minute phone calls, and shared no goodbyes. Years earlier, she had severed ties with her family and distanced herself from most friends. Even her childhood friend, Dawn Botkins, who had been a consistent presence through letters, was absent. Aileen met her fate without anyone by her side, a clear contrast to the widespread attention her case had garnered. That night, the prison settled into its usual stillness. Aileen lay on her narrow bed, closing her eyes as the hours stretched on. For someone whose life had been filled with chaos and upheaval, the quiet felt almost unnatural. The final morning. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos woke earlier than usual. The weight of the day ahead was unmistakable. According to Florida Department of Corrections spokesperson Sterling Ivey, Aileen made a simple request: a towel and washcloth to freshen up. It was a small, quiet gesture of preparation for what was to come. She declined the traditional last meal, which could have been anything she wanted under $20. Instead, she asked for a single cup of black coffee. The simplicity of her choice felt fitting for someone who had spent much of her life living with so little. As she drank her coffee, Aileen spent her last hours in silence, in her cell, lying on her bed and reading. There were no final phone calls or visitors, no emotional farewells. Her solitude remained unbroken and her constant companion. By mid-morning, the atmosphere outside Florida State Prison was anything but calm. Protesters on both sides of the death penalty debate gathered in heated confrontation. Aileen's case had turned her into a polarizing symbol, sparking ongoing discussions about justice, societal failures, and the complexities of her life. Her execution reignited those debates, making her final moments a spectacle for many. Inside the prison, however, the mood was subdued and controlled. Correctional officers carried out their duties with methodical precision, ensuring every step of the process adhered to protocol. While chaos brewed beyond the gates, inside the focus was solely on Aileen and the final hours of her life. At 9:45 a.m., guards arrived at her cell to escort her to the death chamber. She remained composed as they led her through the sterile hallways, shackled at the wrists. The harsh fluorescent lights above illuminated the polished floors as her steady steps echoed through the corridors. Witnesses later described her demeanor as calm and resigned, as though she had made peace with what was about to happen. In the execution chamber, Aileen was guided to the gurney. Dressed in a simple prison uniform, she lay down without resistance as the guards restrained her arms and prepared the intravenous lines. The brightly lit clinical environment left no room for comfort. Behind the heavy curtains, 32 witnesses sat silently, observing through the glass partition. Among them were journalists, legal representatives, and family members of her victims, each watching the final moments unfold. Her final statement and the execution. Just before the lethal injection, Aileen Wuornos was given the opportunity to make a final statement. "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back, she said. Her words, cryptic and unsettling, left many in the room unsure of their meaning. Some viewed them as evidence of a fractured mental state, while others saw them as a final act of defiance. Whatever the interpretation, her statement added another layer of intrigue to an already complex story. With her last words spoken, the process continued. A guard activated the mechanism to release the lethal chemicals into her veins. Aileen lay still, staring at the ceiling as her breathing slowed. Her expression remained calm, revealing no visible fear or resistance. Witnesses, including journalists, legal representatives, and family members of her victims, watched intently from behind a glass partition. Over the next several minutes, her complexion kept getting pale, and her body grew still as the chemicals took effect. The oppressive quiet in the chamber made each second feel endless. After 8 minutes, the attending physician stepped forward to confirm the execution was complete. He turned to the warden and gave a single nod. The warden picked up the phone to inform the governor, though his words were inaudible to the witnesses. With another nod, the curtains were drawn, signaling the end of the execution. At exactly 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was pronounced dead. She was 46 years old. The aftermath. The case of Aileen Wuornos sparked widespread debate about justice, mental health, and the societal factors that shape individuals. Was she a victim of her circumstances, lashing out in a world that had consistently failed her? Or was she a calculated killer, fully aware of her actions? The truth remains elusive, with perspectives on her life and crimes continuing to polarize audiences. Aileen's life story has been immortalized in books, documentaries, and films, including the Academy Award-winning Monster, 2003, which portrayed her as both a victim and a perpetrator. In the end, Aileen's execution closed one chapter, but left the debates surrounding her life and crimes unresolved. For her, it was the escape she had long sought, an end to the pain and infamy that defined her story. On January 5, 1993, Wesley Allen Dodd became the last person in the United States to be executed by hanging, the method he chose for himself. A man whose crimes were as chilling as his calm acceptance of his fate.
In just over an hour from now, Washington State will enforce the ultimate penalty. Wesley Dodd will die for killing 3 small boys.
Dodd was no ordinary criminal. His final 24 hours offer a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a predator who showed no remorse for the pain he caused. But what led him to this point? What kind of person asks to be hanged, believing it's the punishment they truly deserve? Early life. Wesley Allen Dodd was born on July 3, 1961, in a small, unassuming town in Washington State. From the start, his life was anything but stable. As the eldest of 3 siblings, he might have been expected to take on a leadership role within his family, but the household's dysfunction left little room for positive development. His parents, struggling with financial instability and emotional disconnect, provided an inconsistent upbringing. Discipline was erratic, sometimes overly harsh, other times absent altogether. This chaotic environment fostered feelings of neglect in Dodd, leaving him emotionally adrift and disconnected from those closest to him. At school, Dodd's isolation deepened. Teachers described him as quiet and unremarkable, often blending into the background. He wasn't a troublemaker or a star student, just another face in the crowd. His classmates, too, viewed him as withdrawn and peculiar, but not necessarily alarming. This lack of attention, whether positive or negative, reinforced a growing sense of invisibility. Over time, he came to believe that he was unimportant to those around him, further fueling his feelings of alienation. Beneath the surface, Dodd harbored deep resentment and a growing sense of distrust. He struggled to form meaningful connections, leaving him without close friendships or a support system. These early years planted the seeds of a worldview that would later become dangerous, one that saw others as obstacles or tools rather than as equals. Even as a child, there were troubling signs that something was amiss. Dodd exhibited a pattern of deviant behavior that began with minor acts of rebellion. He was frequently caught lying and stealing, actions dismissed at the time as typical childhood mischief. However, his fascination with control and dominance began to emerge in unsettling ways. He became fixated on stories of power, whether through crime novels or sensationalized accounts of violence in the media. This obsession hinted at the darker tendencies that would define his life. As Dodd entered adolescence, his behavior escalated. He began peeping into neighbors' windows and engaging in voyeurism, acts that reflected a growing disregard for boundaries. These invasions of privacy were his way of exerting control, a recurring theme in his life. Each act emboldened him, reinforcing the belief that he could act without facing serious consequences. His family, preoccupied with their own struggles, failed to intervene, while teachers dismissed his withdrawn demeanor as mere shyness. The warning signs, though present, went unnoticed or unaddressed, allowing his behavior to spiral unchecked. Dodd's thoughts became increasingly preoccupied with younger children, a fixation he managed to keep hidden from those around him. While most teenagers were navigating social dynamics and awkward crushes, Dodd retreated into a private world of inappropriate fantasies. These thoughts began to manifest subtly in his behavior, but the lack of consequences only emboldened him further. His inability to form healthy relationships deepened his internal struggles, pushing him further into isolation and resentment. By the time he reached adulthood, Dodd had developed a hardened sense of entitlement. He saw societal rules as mere inconveniences, easily ignored when they clashed with his desires. His minor run-ins with law enforcement for petty theft only reinforced this belief, as he consistently avoided serious punishment. This disregard for authority became a cornerstone of his worldview, enabling him to justify his increasingly deviant actions. Despite his growing detachment from moral and social norms, Dodd maintained an outward appearance of normalcy. He held various jobs and interacted with neighbors, presenting himself as an unremarkable, quiet individual. Beneath this facade, however, was a man consumed by dark desires and meticulously planning how to act on them. His ability to live a double life, masking his true intentions while blending into society, was both calculated and deeply disturbing. During his teenage years, control remained a defining theme in Dodd's life. In fact, Dodd's fixation on control took on a more disturbing form. Whether through manipulative behavior, petty theft, or voyeurism, he sought to dominate those around him. Each act of control fed his need for power, setting the stage for the crimes he would later commit. His early life and adolescence, marked by neglect, isolation, and unchecked deviance, became the foundation for a dangerous trajectory that would ultimately shock the world. Wesley Allen Dodd's descent into criminality began with small but telling acts. As a teenager, he started by stealing small items, seemingly insignificant offenses, but ones that gave him a sense of control. Over time, his actions escalated. He began to harm animals, a disturbing behavior often seen in individuals with violent tendencies. These early acts revealed his lack of empathy and growing disregard for societal norms. Late teens, Dodd had moved on to voyeuristic behavior, spying on neighbors and exposing himself in public spaces. These incidents marked his first strike into the kind of predatory behavior that would define his future crimes. On one occasion, a neighbor reported his voyeuristic activities to his parents, but instead of addressing the issue, they brushed it off as a phase. While Dodd's criminal acts initially seemed all over the place, they began to intensify in both frequency and severity during his early adulthood. Multiple arrests for indecent exposure and other sexual offenses highlighted his inability or unwillingness to curb his behavior. Each time he was caught, he faced minimal consequences, emboldening him to push further. A pivotal moment came when he realized how easily he could manipulate situations to avoid detection, fueling his belief that he was untouchable. This realization marked a dangerous turning point as his fantasies grew darker and his actions more calculated. The failures of the legal system to hold him accountable only reinforced his sense of invincibility. Dodd's shift from deviant behavior to outright predation was not sudden, but deliberate. In the years leading up to his first known murder, he became more methodical, planning his actions with precision. He began frequenting parks and playgrounds, places where he could observe and target vulnerable children. His fantasies, which had once been confined to his mind, became too overwhelming to ignore. A failed attempt to lure a child in a public setting became the catalyst for his next step, plotting abductions in secluded areas where he could exert total control. These events set the stage for the atrocities that followed, solidifying his transition from fantasist to predator. In interviews after his arrest, Dodd revealed glimpses of his thought process. He justified his actions by claiming they were an extension of his desires, urges he insisted he could not suppress. He described his victims not as individuals, but as objects of his need for control and gratification, further demonstrating his detachment from humanity. Though he occasionally expressed regret, it often felt performative, as if calculated to manipulate those around him. Long before his first murder, Dodd deliberately sought out jobs that gave him access to children, including roles as a camp counselor and a delivery driver in family neighborhoods. His movements were deliberate, his intentions clear in hindsight. Those who encountered him during this period often remarked on his quiet demeanor, never suspecting the predatory nature lurking beneath. He kept journals where he detailed fantasies and plans, further showcasing his meticulous approach. Each step, whether a calculated job change or a new method of observation, brought him closer to committing his first murder. Escalation of crimes. Wesley Allen Dodd's first known murder occurred in September 1989. He targeted two young boys, Cole Neer, aged 11, and William Neer, aged 10, in David Douglas Park in Vancouver, Washington. The brothers were playing when Dodd approached them, pretending to need help with directions. He lured them into a secluded area where he tied them up before committing the crime. This disturbing act marked the beginning of his descent into serial murder. His calculated approach demonstrated an alarming mix of patience and predation, setting the tone for his future actions. Following the murder of the Neer brothers, Dodd grew more confident and methodical. Less than a month later, he targeted a 4-year-old boy, Lee Iseli, whom he abducted from a playground. This time, Dodd kept the child alive for several hours, escalating the brutality of his crimes. He documented his actions in a journal, detailing his methods and fantasies, further highlighting his depravity. Unlike his first murders, which were impulsive, this crime showed an increased level of planning. His growing confidence allowed him to refine his tactics, making him even more dangerous. Dodd's downfall came from his increasing overconfidence. He frequented public spaces like parks and playgrounds where his behavior became noticeable. In November 1989, he attempted to abduct another child from a movie theater, but his plan was thwarted when the child's screams alerted others. This crucial mistake gave law enforcement the break they needed to track him down. This incident helped with the investigation into Wesley Allen Dodd's crimes, which was initially hampered by a lack of concrete leads. Law enforcement faced a daunting reality. Initially, his victims were seemingly random, making it difficult to establish a clear pattern. The movie theater incident broke the case wide open. Witnesses provided descriptions of the suspect and his vehicle, prompting officers to track his movements. During their search, authorities uncovered disturbing evidence, written notes detailing his plans and crimes, along with his journal, which contained graphic accounts of his actions. These discoveries not only linked Dodd to the murders, but also revealed the depth of his depravity, inspiring a full-scale effort to capture him. Wesley Allen Dodd was apprehended shortly after his botched abduction attempt. His repeated visits to the same types of locations made it easier for authorities to establish a pattern and anticipate his next move. A vigilant movie theater employee noted his suspicious behavior and quickly alerted authorities. When police arrived, Dodd was still in the vicinity, unaware that his presence had drawn attention. The arrest was swift and uneventful. Dodd did not resist, though his demeanor remained eerily calm. News of Wesley Allen Dodd's crimes came as a surprise to everyone. The sheer brutality of his actions, coupled with his lack of remorse, sparked widespread outrage. Parents were horrified that such a predator had gone unnoticed for so long, leading to calls for stricter child safety measures and harsher punishments for offenders. After his arrest, Wesley Allen Dodd wasted no time confessing to his crimes. His demeanor was unnervingly calm as he detailed his actions with disturbing precision. During police interviews, he described how he selected his victims, lured them, and carried out his horrific acts. Dodd showed no remorse, often speaking about his crimes as if they were routine. In his confession, he even admitted to plans for future crimes, including creating a torture chamber for young children, a revelation that horrified investigators. His journals, discovered during the investigation, contained graphic accounts and plans, reinforcing his premeditated intent. Dodd's confessions were not just admissions of guilt. They were a window into a deeply disturbed mind that sought control and power through unspeakable acts. The sentencing. Wesley Allen Dodd's trial in 1990 was swift and decisive, which goes on to prove the overwhelming evidence and his full confession. His guilt was never in question. Dodd openly admitted to the murders of Cole and William Neer, ages 11 and 10, and 4-year-old Lee Isley. He detailed his crimes with unsettling precision, leaving the courtroom no choice but to focus solely on the punishment he deserved. During the sentencing phase, the courtroom was filled with victims' families, reporters, and members of the public eager to witness justice unfold. Emotional testimony from the families laid bare the devastation Dodd had caused. Parents spoke through tears, recounting the profound void left by their children's deaths. Lee Isley's parents described the heartache of knowing their young son's life was taken so cruelly, and the lasting fear his loss instilled in their family. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with many attendees visibly shaken by the details shared. Dodd, in contrast, remained disturbingly calm. He offered little in the way of a defense, admitting outright that he deserved to die for his crimes. His lack of remorse only added to the weight of the moment. In a shocking move, Dodd requested the death penalty, specifically asking to be executed by hanging. This rare and symbolic method had not been used in decades, making it a controversial choice. Some viewed it as a just and fitting punishment for his heinous acts, while others saw it as unnecessarily brutal, a reflection of the man himself. The judge ultimately agreed, sentencing Dodd to death by hanging. This decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond, as it marked one of the rarest uses of hanging as a modern execution method. The verdict quickly became a focal point in public discourse, sparking debates about the morality and symbolism of such a sentence. The broader impact of Dodd's sentencing reached far beyond the courtroom. Communities nationwide began reevaluating child safety measures, leading to the implementation of stricter policies in schools, playgrounds, and public spaces. Law enforcement and lawmakers worked to improve systems for identifying and tracking potential predators, a legacy directly tied to the horrors of Dodd's actions. For the families of Dodd's victims, the emotional scars remained, a constant reminder of the innocence that was stolen. While the sentencing offered a sense of justice, it could never truly repair the damage done. Still, the image of Dodd facing the gallows stood as a symbol of accountability, a rare moment when the punishment fit the unfathomable scale of the crimes. The last 24 hours. Following his sentencing in 1990, Wesley Allen Dodd spent nearly 3 years on death row at the Washington State Penitentiary. Unlike most death row inmates, Dodd refused to appeal his sentence, insisting that his crimes deserved the harshest punishment. This decision accelerated his execution date, marking him as one of the rare individuals eager to face their sentence. During his time in solitary confinement, Dodd's behavior remained unsettlingly calm. He spent his days writing in a journal and corresponding with legal representatives, offering little reflection or remorse for his actions. His journals, later released, revealed disturbing details about his crimes and hinted at his acceptance of his fate. On January 4, 1993, the final full day of his life, Dodd declined visits from spiritual advisors and made no public statements. He spent the day in silence, isolated in his cell, showing no signs of fear or regret. His only request was a simple last meal of salmon, potatoes, and vegetables. There were no dramatic outbursts or gestures, just a quiet resignation to the inevitable. Dodd's execution garnered significant attention, not only for his horrific crimes, but also for his choice of execution method, which was by hanging. By the 1990s, hanging was nearly obsolete in the United States, replaced by methods like lethal injection. Yet Dodd specifically requested it, claiming it was the only punishment fitting for the kind of crimes he had committed. This choice reignited debates about capital punishment, with some viewing it as a symbolic act of justice, while others deemed it an outdated and barbaric relic of the past. The morning of January 5, 1993, began quietly at the Washington State Penitentiary, yet the heavy anticipation surrounding Wesley Allen Dodd's fate hung over everyone present. Guards noted that his demeanor remained composed, his detached calmness mirroring the unsettling lack of remorse he had displayed since his sentencing. He declined a traditional breakfast, choosing instead to spend his final hours in silence. His only written note, later revealed, contained no apology to the families of his victims. Instead, it was a disturbing acknowledgement of his crimes, highlighting the lack of humanity that defined his actions. As the clock moved closer to midnight, the prison staff began the formal preparations for his execution. The gallows, a clear and rarely used apparatus, had been thoroughly inspected in the days prior to ensure it functioned without error. The noose, meticulously tied and measured to exact specifications, was designed to deliver a swift and effective hanging. Many staff members, unfamiliar with carrying out such a rare method of execution, found the process emotionally taxing. The knowledge that the event would forever remain imprinted in their memories weighed heavily on them. By 11:30 p.m., witnesses began gathering in the execution chamber. The room, small and lit with clear fluorescent lighting, felt claustrophobic as legal representatives, journalists, and selected members of the public took their seats. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the moment palpable. Outside the prison walls, crowds gathered, their emotions split between outrage and vindication. Protesters holding signs denouncing capital punishment stood alongside those demanding justice for Dodd's young victims. The divide reflected the broader societal debate that his case had reignited. At exactly 12:05 a.m., Dodd was escorted into the chamber by 2 guards. His measured footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent room, amplifying the unease felt by those present. He displayed no visible emotion, no fear, no regret, only the same disturbing detachment that had characterized his final years. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, Dodd declined. His silence added to the tension, leaving many witnesses unnerved. The execution proceeded with clinical precision. A black hood was placed over Dodd's head, obscuring his face from view. The noose was then secured around his neck, its knot positioned meticulously to ensure a quick and efficient death. The room remained eerily silent as the lever was pulled and the trapdoor beneath him opened. Witnesses watched as the method, though swift, served as a grim reminder of the severity of his crimes. Inside the chamber, emotions ran high. Some felt relief, believing that justice had been served. Others, particularly members of the victims' families, experienced a mix of closure and lingering grief. For the parents of Lee Isley, Dodd's youngest victim, the execution marked the end of a long and harrowing journey. They expressed a measured sense of relief, acknowledging that while Dodd's death could never undo the pain he caused, it symbolized a form of justice for their son. Outside, News of the execution spread quickly. Supporters of capital punishment viewed the event as a necessary consequence for one of the most heinous crimes in modern history. Protesters, however, decried the use of hanging, calling it barbaric and out of place in a modern justice system. The intense media coverage ensured that every moment of the night was scrutinized, cementing the execution of Wesley Allen Dodd as both a historical and moral landmark in the debate over the death penalty. The execution of Wesley Allen Dodd marked one of the last recorded hangings in the United States, cementing its place in the history of American capital punishment. For the families of his victims, it brought a measure of closure to years of unimaginable pain. However, the event also reignited debates about the ethics and effectiveness of the death penalty, particularly the use of hanging in the modern era. Beyond the immediate debates, Dodd's case left a lasting impact on child safety awareness. His crimes prompted communities, schools, and law enforcement to adopt stricter safety measures, ensuring children were better protected from predators. Though his death marked the end of a harrowing chapter, the ripples of his actions and the justice served continued to influence public policy and societal reflection for years to come. For over 16 years, Whitey Bulger was the FBI's most wanted fugitive, eluding capture while leaving behind a trail of destruction. As one of America's most infamous crime bosses, he ruled Boston's underworld with an iron fist, orchestrating crimes so disturbing they remain imprinted in history.
He ruled by fear, he ruled by charm, he was always one step ahead of everybody else.
But his reign of terror ended in the most brutal and mysterious way imaginable, his final 24 hours becoming a story as shocking as the life he led, the early years. Born on September 3, 1929, James Joseph Whitey Bulger grew up in the impoverished streets of South Boston. His parents, James Sr. and Jane, were Irish American, but life in the Bulger household wasn't easy. James Sr., a laborer on the docks, suffered a disabling workplace injury, leaving the family in financial distress, forcing the Bulgers to move into public housing at the Mary Ellen McCormick Project. In a household of 6 siblings, Whitey stood apart for his rebellious streak. His brother Billy, the youngest of the family, would eventually take a very different path, rising to become one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts. Southie, South Boston itself, was a world of poverty and crime. The area was dominated by Irish mobsters who controlled the streets with an iron fist, becoming both a warning and an inspiration to young men like Whitey. This environment not only normalized crime, but also offered a blueprint for survival and power. For boys like Whitey, toughness was not just admired, it was essential for survival. Neighborhood loyalty ran deep, and disputes were often settled with fists rather than words. Even as a child, Whitey had a reputation that set him apart. He was daring, fiercely independent, and unafraid of confrontation. By his early teens, he was involved in theft, street fights, and gang-related activities. He didn't just follow the rules of the streets, he rewrote them, setting himself apart as someone who could navigate the dangerous currents of Southie with ease.
By the time he was in his early teens, it was pretty clear that Whitey had decided he was going to be a criminal.
While his peers were content with small-time hustles, Whitey had bigger aspirations. He wasn't interested in being just another face in the crowd. He wanted control, and that allowed him to climb the ranks of Southie's criminal underworld. His first encounters with the law came early. As a teenager, he was arrested multiple times for minor offenses, like theft and disorderly conduct. Each arrest added to his notoriety in the neighborhood. Juvenile detention became a familiar place for him, but instead of deterring him, it only fueled his defiance. He emerged tougher, angrier, and more determined to forge his path outside the boundaries of the law. As he moved into adulthood, Bulger's ambitions grew bolder. He graduated from petty theft to armed robbery, targeting banks and daring heists that showcased his audacity. It wasn't long before federal authorities caught up with him, leading to his first significant prison sentence. During his time behind bars, he was transferred to several facilities, including the infamous Alcatraz. In the 1950s, Alcatraz was a place for America's most hardened criminals, and Bulger fit right in. While there, he participated in controversial CIA-backed experiments, reportedly involving LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as acid or Lucy, a powerful psychedelic drug that can intensify thoughts, emotions, and sensory perception in exchange for reduced sentences. These experiments highlighted his willingness to take risks, even with his own mind, if it meant gaining gaining an advantage. His time in Alcatraz reinforced his image as someone who couldn't be broken, and that earned him respect among fellow inmates and the criminal underworld. Even as a prisoner, Bulger's persona loomed large. He was known as Whitey due to his light blonde hair, a nickname he despised but couldn't shake. Despite his disdain for the nickname, it stuck, becoming synonymous with the fear and control he would later wield over Boston's crime scene. By the time he left prison, Whitey Bulger wasn't just another small-time crook. He had emerged with the skills, connections, and hardened mindset that would soon propel him to the top of Boston's criminal hierarchy. Crime boss and the FBI connection. Whitey Bulger's criminal empire began to gain notoriety in the 1970s as he solidified his position within Boston's infamous Winter Hill Gang. Initially a trusted member, Bulger's ambition and ruthless tactics helped him rise to the top, eventually taking over leadership of the gang. Under his command, the Winter Hill Gang became a powerhouse in Boston's crime scene. Through extortion, drug trafficking, loan sharking, and money laundering, he built an empire that thrived on fear and control. Bulger's reputation for violence was central to his rule. Known for his brutal tactics, he eliminated threats with a terrifying efficiency, often orchestrating or personally carrying out the murders of his rivals, informants, or anyone who crossed him. Each act of violence sent a clear message. Snitching, disloyalty, or defiance would not be tolerated. But while his ruthlessness cemented his grip on power, his charisma allowed him to maintain a different image in South Boston. To many in the community, he was a protector, a man who kept the streets safe from outside threats and occasionally offered financial help to struggling locals. This duality of protector and predator made him a uniquely dangerous figure. People either admired him or feared him, but no one ignored him. One of the most controversial aspects of Bulger's reign was his relationship with the FBI. In the late 1970s, he developed a partnership with FBI agent John Connolly. Officially, Bulger became an informant, feeding the FBI information about the Italian Mafia, his primary rivals in Boston. This arrangement helped the FBI dismantle the Patriarca crime family, but it also granted Bulger near-total immunity. With law enforcement focused on his enemies, Bulger operated with impunity, eliminating competition while expanding his influence. However, this alliance wasn't purely transactional. Bulger skillfully manipulated Connolly and others within the FBI, ensuring they turned a blind eye to his activities. He used the Bureau as a shield, staying steps ahead of investigations and consolidating power while the FBI provided cover. For over a decade, this relationship allowed Bulger to thrive, making him virtually untouchable. The alliance began to unravel in the 1990s as internal investigations exposed corruption within the FBI. The revelation that Bulger had been protected by law enforcement sparked outrage. Public trust in the FBI was shaken, and the agency faced intense scrutiny for its role in enabling Bulger's reign of terror. As the walls closed in, Bulger's immunity vanished, and federal authorities turned their attention to dismantling his empire. In 1994, an indictment on multiple charges, including racketeering and murder, forced Bulger into hiding. The indictment named him as the mastermind behind numerous violent crimes, cementing his reputation as one of America's most dangerous criminals. Bulger, however, had an advantage. FBI agent John Connolly, the same man who had protected him for years, tipped him off about the impending arrest. He had no choice but to go on a run and leave behind Boston, marking the beginning of one of the most infamous manhunts in American history for the next 16 years, during which Bulger became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Bulger remained a ghost, evading capture while his former associates faced justice. His downfall, however, began with the very system he had once exploited. The exposure of the FBI's corrupt relationship with Bulger brought his criminal empire crashing down, leaving only questions of how he had managed to operate so freely for so long. Bulger fled with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gray. Together, they meticulously planned their life on the run, adopting false identities to stay off the radar and moving from one location to another to avoid detection. For much of their time in hiding, they lived in plain sight. In Santa Monica, California, the couple lived frugally, relying on cash stashes. They rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, blending in as an unassuming older couple. Bulger, using the name Charlie Gasco, lived a low-profile life, frequently walking his neighborhood and befriending locals who never suspected the truth. Catherine Gray's devotion to Bulger played a critical role in maintaining their cover. though it also attracted attention from authorities. The breakthrough came in June 2011 when the FBI received a tip from a woman in Iceland who had seen a news report about Greg. She recognized the woman as her former neighbor in Santa Monica. Acting quickly, agents staked out the apartment complex and confirmed the tip. Bulger's arrest on June 22, 2011 marked the end of one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in FBI history. The raid on his apartment revealed a shocking arsenal. More than 30 firearms, $822,000 in cash hidden in the walls, and multiple fake IDs. For a man who had lived under the radar for so long, the discovery of such preparation was a testament to his paranoia and readiness for a violent confrontation. However, the arrest itself was quiet. Bulger surrendered without a fight. The news of his capture came as a surprise to everyone. For years, Whitey Bulger had been a symbol of lawlessness, corruption, and impunity. His arrest brought a sense of closure to the victims of his crimes and their families, though it also reignited questions about the FBI's role in enabling his decades-long reign of terror, conviction, and sentencing. In 2013, after years of evading justice, Whitey Bulger finally faced the courtroom. His trial in Boston was a spectacle, drawing widespread media attention and reopening old wounds for the families of his victims. The charges against him were staggering: 19 murders, racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and drug trafficking. The government presented a mountain of evidence, including testimony from former associates who had turned against him. These witnesses, some of whom were murderers themselves, described in disturbing detail how Bulger orchestrated and committed acts of violence to maintain his iron grip on Boston's crime scene. People already knew about his crime, but this trial revealed the depth of his crimes, including the brutal murders of rivals, informants, and even innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. One of the most shocking revelations was the cold, calculated manner in which Bulger operated. He was described as a man who ruled through fear, using violence not just as a tool, but as a message to anyone who dared oppose him. His victims' families gave emotional testimonies, recounting years of pain and loss caused by Bulger's actions. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Bulger maintained his innocence on certain charges, claiming he was never an informant for the FBI, a claim that had long been a source of controversy. However, the jury ultimately convicted him on 31 counts, including 11 murders. The verdict was a resounding condemnation of Bulger's decades-long reign of terror. On November 14, 2013, Bulger was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The judge labeled his crimes heinous and described him as a man who had left a trail of destruction and suffering in his wake. For the families of his victims, his sentencing to life in prison was supposed to be the final chapter, a man stripped of his power, living out his days behind bars. But for Bulger, the story wasn't over. The final 24 hours. Fast forward to October 29, 2018. By this point, Whitey Bulger had spent just over 7 years in federal custody following his 2011 capture after 16 years on the run. The 89-year-old, once a feared crime boss, was now frail, confined to a wheelchair, and reportedly in declining health. That morning, he was quietly transferred from USP Coleman in Florida to USP Hazleton in West Virginia, a prison infamous for its violence and known by the sinister nickname Misery Mountain. The timing and decision to move Bulger came under immediate scrutiny. Hazleton was a high-security facility notorious for housing some of the country's most dangerous inmates, including violent gang members and mafia figures. It had already seen multiple inmate murders earlier that year, a grim indicator of the risks that awaited new arrivals. The timing of Bulger's transfer was puzzling, and critics questioned why such a high-profile, high-risk inmate was placed in a general population unit in one of the most volatile prisons in the federal system. For many, it was a decision that defied logic and raised suspicions about whether it was truly a matter of routine or something more deliberate by the higher-ups. But nonetheless, this decision would set the stage for the final 24 hours of one of America's most notorious crime bosses. Due to the unusual circumstances surrounding his transfer, rumors quickly spread that the transfer was designed to put Bulger in harm's way. As a former FBI informant who had betrayed members of organized crime, Bulger was despised by countless inmates who considered him a traitor. Allegations arose that someone within the Bureau of Prisons might have orchestrated the move to expose Bulger to danger, potentially to ensure the damaging secrets from his criminal past, and his controversial relationship with the FBI remained buried. The lack of added protections only fueled speculation that this was no ordinary transfer. This wasn't the first time Bulger's safety had come into question during his time in custody. After his sentencing in 2013, he had faced numerous threats from fellow inmates, even when he served his time at the USP Coleman in Florida, many of whom viewed him as the ultimate symbol of betrayal. Incidents of harassment and intimidation followed him at nearly every facility he was housed in. Despite this, the Bureau of Prisons placed him in general population at Hazleton, a move that left even some staff baffled. How could one of America's most infamous informants be sent to a prison filled with inmates who had every reason to seek revenge for being a snitch? When Bulger arrived at Hazleton that afternoon, alarms were raised among those familiar with the prison's volatile dynamics. Hazleton was home to violent criminals, including mafia members with long-standing grudges against snitches and informants. Among its inmates was Faudios Freddy Gias, a former mafia hitman serving a life sentence for his involvement in organized crime. Gias, who had a deep disdain for rats, would later be named as one of the key suspects in Bulger's murder. To many observers, Hazleton seemed like the worst possible destination for someone like Bulger. His placement in general population defied standard protocol for inmates of his notoriety and vulnerability. Prison staff, who were aware of the volatile mix of inmates, reportedly questioned the decision, but were unable to intervene. The Bureau of Prisons came under fire almost immediately after his transfer. Critics accused the agency of negligence, pointing to the lack of extra security measures for such a high-risk prisoner. Some even suggested deliberate oversight, questioning whether Bulger's transfer and vulnerability were accidents at all. Bulger's reputation only heightened the tension. To the prison's population, he was not just another inmate, he was a symbol of betrayal, a dishonest and greedy man who had evaded justice for decades while working with the FBI to protect himself. This made him an ideal target for those seeking vengeance or notoriety. The stage was set for what would be Bulger's final day. On October 30, 2018, Whitey Bulger's first full day at USP Hazleton began like any other for the prison's general population. He was confined to a wheelchair, an aging figure among a dangerous mix of violent offenders. Bulger, known for being a very cunning man, reportedly kept to himself, observing his surroundings. There are no confirmed reports of him expressing concerns about his safety, but the risk was clear to anyone aware of his history. In the early hours of October 30, 2018, while most inmates at USP Hazleton were still asleep, a group of men entered Whitey Bulger's cell. The assault was swift and brutal. Using a padlock tied inside a sock, the attackers beat Bulger repeatedly, focusing on his face and head. The discovery of Bulger's body by the prison staff added to the sense of outrage and mystery. When prison staff found him, his lifeless body was still in the chair, bloodied and beaten beyond recognition. Witnesses and later reports revealed that Bulger was tied to his chair during the attack, unable to defend himself. The gruesome nature of the scene highlighted the brutality of the attack. The facility was placed on immediate lockdown as authorities scrambled to contain the fallout. The details of the attack fueled immediate speculation. One of the suspected attackers, Faudios Freddy Gies, was a mafia associate with a long-standing hatred for snitches and informants. For men like Gies, Bulger's history as an FBI informant represented the ultimate betrayal, a cardinal sin in the world of organized crime that can never be forgiven. The ferocity of the attack suggested it was personal, possibly driven by a desire to send a message. Bulger's death certificate lists his time of death as 8:21 a.m., officially ruling his death as a homicide due to blunt force injuries of the head. The U.S. Department of Justice later reported that prison officials failed to properly assess whether Bulger faced harm from other inmates at Hazleton, a facility notorious for being understaffed and dangerous. In August 2022, new details revealed that inmates knew of Bulger's impending transfer, leading to a planned attack that lasted just 7 minutes. But the circumstances surrounding the murder raised deeper questions. Some allege that the attack wasn't just an inmate retaliation, but part of a broader conspiracy. Critics pointed to the suspicious timing of Bulger's transfer to Hazleton, a facility with a reputation for violence, and the decision to place him in general population despite his high-risk status. Theories emerged that individuals within the Bureau of Prisons or other powerful figures wanted Bulger silenced. His decades-long career as a crime boss and informant meant he carried secrets that could implicate others, potentially making his death convenient for some. The FBI quickly launched an investigation, but the implications were troubling. How could one of the country's most infamous inmates with a known history of being a target be left vulnerable in such a dangerous environment? The Bureau of Prisons faced intense criticism, with allegations of negligence or worse. In September 2024, Fodio's Freddie Gies, already serving a life sentence, received an additional 25 years for his role in Bulger's murder. The Justice Department's watchdog report highlighted deeply troubling failures that led to Bulger's death less than 12 hours after his arrival at the West Virginia prison. For the victims of Bulger's crimes and their families, his death brought mixed emotions. Some saw it as long overdue justice, a violent end befitting a man who had caused so much pain. Others felt cheated, robbed of the chance to see him live out his life in prison, facing the consequences of his actions. The murder of Whitey Bulger remains one of the most controversial events for men like Gies' history. Whether the result of negligence, revenge, or something more sinister, his violent end marked the final chapter of a life defined by power, betrayal, and brutality. Those who knew Whitey Bulger remember him as a polarizing man. His violent death marked the end of one of America's darkest criminal sagas, but it left behind a trail of unresolved questions. How could a man so feared and so infamous meet such a fate in federal custody? And who, if anyone, should be held accountable? As with much of Whitey Bulger's life, the answers remain shrouded in mystery and speculation. Dressed as Pogo the Clown, John Wayne Gacy turned children's entertainment into a mask of unspeakable horror. From using his handcuff trick to overpower his victims to exploiting his successful business to target over 33 young men and boys, all while telling the world to kiss his ass on his deathbed. Gacy became one of the most prolific and terrifying serial killers in history. Early life. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, into a household full of tension and dysfunction. Gacy, the second of 3 children, grew up under the heavy shadow of his father, John Stanley Gacy, a factory worker and a World War I veteran. His father was notoriously strict, often resorting to physical violence and verbal abuse to assert his dominance over the household. His mother, Marion Elaine, provided what solace she could, but her efforts were often overshadowed by the oppressive environment created by her husband. From an early age, Gacy sought his father's approval, but rarely received it. His father frequently berated him, calling him all sorts of names like sissy and accusing him of being weak. He once beat him with a leather belt for accidentally disarranging a car engine his father had been working on. This constant belittlement left a deep emotional scar on Gacy, fostering a desperate need for validation and control. Adding to his struggles, Gacy battled several health issues, including a congenital heart condition that prevented him from participating in physical activities and sports. His inability to meet traditional standards of masculinity further fueled his father's disdain. As Gacy entered his teenage years, his health issues continued to isolate him. He was overweight and often the target of bullying from classmates, which compounded his sense of alienation. Gacy also began grappling with his identity, particularly regarding his sexual orientation. Living in a conservative 1950s environment, these feelings were accompanied by confusion and shame. Socially awkward and yearning for acceptance, especially from his father, Gacy began to develop skills in manipulation, using charm and humor to navigate relationships. These traits, while seemingly innocent at the time, hinted at the deceptive persona he would later master. One turning point came when Gacy took a job as an assistant at a mortuary during his late teens. While there, he lived in a small space within the building and reportedly became fascinated with death. There are disturbing accounts that suggest he engaged in inappropriate behavior while alone with corpses, though these claims remain speculative. Whether true or not, this phase marked the beginning of Gacy's increasingly dark and secretive behavior. Returning to Chicago after a brief stint in Las Vegas in his early 20s, Gacy enrolled in Northwestern Business College, earning a degree that allowed him to secure a management position at a shoe company. It was during this time that he met his first wife, Marlynn Myers. The two married in 1964 and moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed several KFC restaurants owned by his father-in-law. In Waterloo, Gacy embraced his role as a husband, father of two, and community leader. He joined the local JCs, a leadership and civic organization, where he quickly rose through the ranks thanks to his charm and dedication. But even as he thrived publicly, Gacy's private life began to unravel. Gacy's darker impulses were beginning to surface. One such moment occurred when neighbors reported seeing Gacy yelling at teenagers he had hired for odd jobs, his temper flaring in ways that seemed disproportionate. While these incidents were often dismissed as misunderstandings, they painted a picture of a man whose pleasant demeanor could quickly shift into something far more menacing. The crimes. In 1968, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble when he was arrested for sexually assaulting a teenage boy. The victim, a young employee of one of Gacy's restaurants, came forward with details of the assault, leading to Gacy's conviction and a 10-year prison sentence. Despite the gravity of the charges, Gacy managed to manipulate the situation to his advantage. While serving time in prison, he quickly adapted to his new environment, earning the trust of prison officials and fellow inmates. He became a model prisoner, volunteering for various tasks and even managing the prison's kitchen. His good behavior earned him an early release after serving just 18 months out of the 10-year sentence. Upon his release, Gacy returned to Chicago, eager to leave his criminal record behind and start anew. He moved in with his mother and began working as a contractor, a role that allowed him to regain a sense of control and authority. To those around him, Gacy seemed like a man who had turned his life around. But beneath the surface, his violent tendencies remained unchecked. The assault conviction was not the only red flag during this period. There were other, quieter incidents, complaints from young men who had worked for Gacy or visited his home. Many of these allegations went unreported, dismissed as misunderstandings or lies. Gacy's return to Chicago marked the beginning of a new chapter. Gacy moved in with his mother in the suburb of Norwood Park, and he became active in local politics, even posing for a photograph with First Lady Rosalynn Carter during a campaign event in 1978. Gacy's career as a contractor proved to be the perfect cover for his dark desires. In 1971, he launched PDM Contractors, a business that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the fabric of suburban life. This business gave him access to a steady stream of young employees. He often hired teenage boys for temporary jobs, presenting himself as a mentor eager to help them build their futures. Many of these boys would later become his victims, lured by the promise of work and the trustworthiness Gacy seemed to embody. As his business grew, so did his reputation in the community. Gacy was known for his generosity, often donating time and money to local causes. He even performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties and charity events, a role that endeared him to parents and children alike. But once again, the cracks in his facade continued to widen. Neighbors began to notice odd smells emanating from his home, a modest ranch house in Norwood Park. Gacy dismissed their concerns, blaming issues with the plumbing or dead animals in the crawl space. These explanations, while plausible at the time, would later become horrifyingly significant. Gacy frequently lured teenage boys under the guise of offering them work or mentorship through his construction company. Once inside his home, Gacy would reveal his true nature, subjecting his victims to unimaginable horrors before silencing them forever. Initially, the disappearances seemed random at first, teenagers and young men vanishing without a trace. Families were left searching for answers, and police had few leads to pursue. But the suburban streets of Norwood Park, Chicago, harbored a sinister secret, one that would only come to light after years of calculated evil. By day, John Wayne Gacy was the friendly clown and successful contractor. By night, his home became the setting for unimaginable horrors. horrors that would take years to uncover. Gacy was a master manipulator, and his victims rarely saw the danger coming. Most were teenage boys and young men, lured by promises of work or mentorship through his construction company, PDM Contractors. He often approached his victims in public places, such as bus stops or local shops, offering them cash for simple jobs. Once they agreed, Gacy would invite them back to his home under the guise of discussing work. Once inside, his mask of friendliness would slip away. He employed a disturbingly effective tactic, introducing a magic trick with handcuffs. Under the pretense of showing off a party trick, Gacy would cuff himself and then escape. When his victims tried, they realized too late that Gacy had the key and control. Once his victims were restrained, Gacy subjected them to psychological torment and physical violence. He used his dominance to instill fear, often prolonging their suffering before ultimately taking their lives. Gacy's charm wasn't just for luring strangers. He targeted people he knew, including acquaintances and even neighbors. His manipulation extended to creating an environment where victims felt safe, offering drinks, food, or a seemingly harmless conversation before revealing his true intentions. The crawl space under Gacy's house became a makeshift burial ground. He buried many of his victims there, wrapping their bodies in plastic sheeting or simply laying them in shallow graves. Over time, the space filled with the remains of young lives cut tragically short. The smell of decay occasionally raised suspicions among neighbors, but Gacy dismissed these concerns with excuses about plumbing issues or dead animals. As Gacy's crimes escalated, so did his arrogance. His sense of invincibility allowed him to continue preying on victims for years undetected. He reveled in the power he held over his victims, taunting them with their helplessness while maintaining his public facade. By December 1978, a disturbing pattern was emerging: young men and boys disappearing without a trace. The final piece of the puzzle came with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest in December 1978. Piest was last seen leaving his part-time job at a pharmacy to meet Gacy about a job opportunity. Before that, Piest had told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a potential job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. His failure to return home set off a chain of events that ultimately led to the unraveling of Gacy's crimes. Unlike previous disappearances, this one drew immediate attention due to Piest's background as a well-liked high school student and the persistence of his family. They pushed law enforcement to dig deeper, leading investigators to John Wayne Gacy. When police first questioned Gacy, he played his role perfectly. He dismissed the meeting with Piest as insignificant and blamed the boy's disappearance on other factors. But his demeanor raised suspicions. Gacy appeared evasive and defensive, dodging questions with well-rehearsed answers. Detectives began surveillance, keeping a close eye on Gacy while quietly gathering evidence. The more they watched, the more the pieces fell into place. Neighbors had reported strange smells coming from Gacy's house for years, which he had attributed to plumbing issues or dead animals. His employees, many of them teenagers, shared unsettling stories about their interactions with him. But the most damning evidence came when police executed a search warrant on Gacy's home. Inside, investigators found troubling items: a class ring, clothing that didn't belong to Gacy, and driver's licenses from missing boys. The circumstantial evidence painted a grim picture, but it wasn't until they searched the crawl space that the true horror began to unfold. On December 21, 1978, armed with a second search warrant, police returned to Gacy's home. This time they focused on the crawl space beneath the house. What they found defied imagination. As officers dug into the cold, damp earth, they uncovered human remains wrapped in plastic. The first discovery was just the beginning. Soon it became clear that this wasn't the body of a single victim, but part of a mass grave. The crawl space contained the remains of numerous young men and boys, buried in shallow graves stacked one on top of another. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and the sheer magnitude of the discovery left even seasoned investigators reeling. Over the following days, the task of excavating the site revealed more and more victims, each adding to the growing horror of Gacy's crimes. During his confession, Gacy showed no remorse. Instead, he framed his actions as necessary or unavoidable, often blaming his victims for their own demise. His lack of empathy was as disturbing as the crimes themselves, painting a picture of a man devoid of humanity. He recounted how he would lure his victims, gain their trust, and ultimately overpower them, describing his methods with cold precision. Gacy admitted to killing 33 young men and boys over the span of several years, 26 of whom were buried in the crawl space beneath his home. The others had been dumped in nearby rivers when the crawl space had become too full. The community's reaction was one of shock and disbelief. The man they had trusted, the man who dressed as a clown to bring joy to children, was revealed to be a predator of unimaginable evil. Candlelight vigils were held for the victims, and families mourned the loss of their loved ones. The case was in every newspaper headline across the country, and Gacy became a household name synonymous with horror. The trial and convictions. The trial of John Wayne Gacy was not just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning for one of the most chilling serial killers in American history. As Gacy entered the courtroom, the weight of his crimes hung heavy in the air. The public's demand for answers and accountability was palpable. Packed courtrooms, widespread media coverage, and the presence of grieving families turned the trial into a spectacle of horror and heartbreak. The prosecution wasted no time painting Gacy as a calculated and remorseless predator. Their case was bolstered by overwhelming evidence, starting with the bodies found in his crawl space. Prosecutors laid out how Gacy lured his victims with promises of work or mentorship before subjecting them to unimaginable torment. Testimonies from survivors added disturbing depth to the narrative. One young man recounted how he narrowly escaped after Gacy's infamous handcuff trick. Another spoke of the threats Gacy made, ensuring his silence for years. These first-hand accounts provided harrowing insight into Gacy's methods and shattered any doubt about his culpability. Gacy's confession, recorded by police, became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In it, he described his actions with a cold detachment, offering a horrifying glimpse into his mind. Prosecutors used his own words to demonstrate his calculated approach to murder, emphasizing that these were not the actions of a man out of control, but of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Gacy's defense team faced a monumental challenge. With physical evidence, survivor testimonies, and a confession, their only viable option was to plead insanity. They argued that Gacy suffered from a multiple personality disorder, claiming that his actions were the result of a darker alter ego he called Jack. Gacy's behavior during the trial added to the eerie atmosphere. At times, he laughed or made inappropriate comments as if he was enjoying the attention. This unsettling demeanor only solidified the image of a man entirely disconnected from the gravity of his actions. Psychiatrists were brought in to support the claim, describing Gacy's supposed dissociation from reality and his inability to control his actions. The defense tried to portray Gacy as a man at war with himself, a narrative they hoped would elicit sympathy, or at least cast doubt on his mental state. However, the prosecution dismantled the insanity defense by highlighting the meticulous planning behind Gacy's crimes. From luring victims to disposing of bodies, his actions were methodical and deliberate. Prosecutors argued that his ability to maintain a public facade while committing these atrocities proved he was fully aware of his actions. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury. The charges were staggering: 33 counts of murder, each carrying the weight of a young life stolen. The deliberation process lasted only 2 hours, highlighting the undeniable evidence against Gacy. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, relief swept through the courtroom. Families of the victims wept openly, their grief mingled with the sense of justice finally being served. Gacy showed little reaction, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. The sentencing phase was equally intense. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, arguing that Gacy's crimes were so heinous that no other punishment could suffice. They detailed the brutality of his murders and the sheer number of lives lost, making a compelling case for capital punishment. The defense attempted to argue for life imprisonment, citing Gacy's supposed mental instability and the potential for rehabilitation. But the jury, like much of the nation, was unmoved. They returned with a unanimous decision: death by lethal injection. While families of the victims expressed relief and sorrow, Gacy seemed almost amused, later commenting that his execution would mean one less John Wayne Gacy in the world. Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he showed no signs of remorse. Instead, he gave interviews in which he denied responsibility for the murders and claimed he had been framed. He insisted that the murders were carried out by others, and he was simply a scapegoat. While on death row, Gacy took up painting, producing a series of clown portraits that became infamous, and many of his paintings were sold to collectors. The sale of these works sparked outrage, with critics accusing buyers of profiting from the suffering of Gacy's victims. His legal team worked tirelessly to delay his execution, filing appeals and attempting to exploit legal loopholes. These efforts stretched the process for years, frustrating the victims' families who longed for closure. The final 24 hours. In the early hours of May 9, 1994, John Wayne Gacy awoke in his cell at Stateville Correctional Center. It was 6:30 a.m., and he was about to meet his fate. Remarkably, Gacy displayed the same unnerving composure that had characterized him throughout his life. He began the day with a modest breakfast of eggs, toast, and coffee, served by the prison staff. Yet, this ordinary ritual carried extraordinary weight, as it marked the start of his countdown to death. During his years in solitary confinement, Gacy had poured himself into painting, creating unsettling clown portraits that would later become infamous. But on this day, the paintbrushes were left untouched. He continued to insist on his innocence, framing himself as a victim of corruption and conspiracy. As the morning progressed, Gacy began receiving visitors. His mother had passed away years earlier, and most of his family had severed ties with him, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he had become. Only one person remained steadfast: his younger sister, Karen. Despite the horrors he had inflicted, Karen clung to their familial bond. Photographs from that day show the siblings embracing. Karen's presence was not an endorsement of her brother's actions, but a reflection of the unbreakable connection she felt as his sister. Throughout the morning, Gacy's legal team made desperate attempts to secure a last-minute reprieve, but their efforts were futile. A Catholic priest also arrived to perform the sacrament of last rites, a ritual Gacy had requested after converting to Catholicism during his time in prison. This solemn moment was one of the few instances that hinted at any contemplation of his impending death. By the afternoon, the preparations for Gacy's execution began in earnest. Around 5:00 p.m., tension enveloped the prison as news crews, demonstrators, and spectators gathered outside. The crowd was divided. Some protested the death penalty on moral grounds, while others demanded justice for Gacy's victims. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was charged as guards and staff carried out their duties with an acute awareness of the significance of the day. At 7 p.m., Gacy was served his final meal. His request: a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. This was a haunting nod to his past as a KFC manager. The meal's normalcy stood in grotesque contrast to the magnitude of his crimes. After eating, Gacy showered and changed into a plain prison uniform. Offered the chance to make a final phone call, he declined, choosing instead to spend his remaining hours with his spiritual advisor and legal team. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Gacy remained disturbingly calm, betraying no signs of remorse or fear. At 11:30 p.m., Gacy was escorted from his holding cell to the execution chamber. The short journey, just a few steps away, carried the weight of finality. Flanked by guards and accompanied by a chaplain, Gacy walked steadily, his expression unreadable. The sterile chamber awaited him, designed to carry out its grim purpose with clinical efficiency. Behind a glass partition, witnesses, including victims' family members, members of the press, and law enforcement officials, watched in tense silence. As Gacy was strapped to the gurney, the room braced for his final words. True to his defiant nature, he smirked and delivered a curt, shocking message: "Kiss my ass." It was a disturbing reminder of his lack of remorse, even in the face of death. At 12:01 a.m. on May 10, 1994, the lethal injection procedure began. The process was designed to be swift, employing a 3-drug cocktail: an anesthetic to induce unconsciousness, a paralytic to halt breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. However, complications arose when the intravenous lines became clogged, delaying the execution for 18 agonizing minutes. Witnesses described the atmosphere as unbearably tense as technicians scrambled to fix the issue. Gacy, however, remained silent and still, his unnerving composure unbroken even in these final moments. Finally, at 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. For some of the victims' families who observed the execution, his death brought a sense of closure and justice. For others, the loss of their loved ones could never be undone, and Gacy's end offered only a bittersweet relief. Outside the prison, crowds erupted in cheers, marking the conclusion of one of the most notorious chapters in American criminal history. In the hours following the execution, Gacy's body was transported to the Illinois Department of Corrections Medical Center for an autopsy. Scientists removed his brain, hoping to uncover clues about what could drive someone to commit such heinous acts. However, no abnormalities were found. 3 days later, Gacy's remains were cremated, and his ashes were returned to his family. Unlike other infamous criminals whose gravesites become macabre attractions, Gacy's final resting place remains unmarked and private. The execution of John Wayne Gacy brought an end to years of anguish for the families of his victims. Yet, the pain and trauma he inflicted will forever linger. His crimes, and the chilling lack of remorse he displayed until the very end, serve as a haunting reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature. She was the first woman executed in Texas in over 135 years, a defining moment in a case that captivated the nation. Carla Tucker's crime was so gruesome, it shocked even hardened investigators. But as her final hours approached, the world watched a woman transformed, raising questions about redemption, justice, and mercy.
I have no fear of that, and I don't worry about myself, but I certainly am concerned for those who are going to be left behind.
What led to her ultimate reckoning, and what were her final moments like? Early life. Born on November 18, 1959, in Houston, Texas, Carla's early years were full of dysfunction and instability. She was the youngest of 3 daughters, but her parents' tumultuous marriage left a huge impact on her childhood. By the time she was 10 years old, her parents had divorced, fracturing what little stability her life had known. From a young age, Carla's world was saturated with influences that would later shape her troubled past. Her mother, Carolyn, had a reputation for being a free spirit, and she often exposed her daughters to the adult world of partying and substance use. This environment left little room for the innocence of childhood. Carla's relationship with her father was equally strained and distant, leaving her with a deep sense of abandonment and a yearning for acceptance. As a child, she was described as bright and outgoing, but these qualities were overshadowed by the chaos in her home. By the time Carla was in her early teens, she was accompanying her mother to bars, witnessing the effects of substance abuse firsthand. This early exposure to substances and alcohol was not incidental. It was formative. The school became another area of instability. Carla's performance in the classroom was inconsistent, and she eventually dropped out by the age of 14. Without the structure of school or a supportive home environment, she found herself drifting toward a life that offered immediate escape but long-term consequences. Her mother's death, when Carla was just 16 years old, became another turning point. Carolyn had succumbed to complications related to substance abuse, and her passing left Carla adrift with no anchor to guide her. As a result, Carla became enmeshed in the world of biker gangs, where drugs and violence were part of the culture. This lifestyle offered her a sense of belonging that she had long craved, but at a devastating cost. Her introduction to hard substances was not an accident, but a natural progression in the circles she moved in. Methamphetamine, in particular, became a cornerstone of her existence. The substance's euphoric highs masked the pain and emptiness she felt, but it also dulled her sense of morality. Friends described her during this period as both vibrant and reckless, someone who lived for the moment with little thought of the consequences. The social circles Carla moved in were a dangerous mix of adrenaline and lawlessness. She became involved with individuals who shared her addiction and her penchant for living on the edge. One of these figures was Daniel Garrett, a fellow addict who would later become her accomplice in the infamous murders. Their relationship was volatile, fueled by their shared addictions and an escalating need for thrill-seeking behavior. What began as a search for belonging soon became an all-consuming lifestyle of drugs, danger, and lawlessness. The vibrant, outgoing child had given way to a hardened, volatile young woman whose choices were driven by desperation and a need to numb the pain of her reality. The crimes. By the time Carla Faye Tucker reached her early 20s, her life was defined by chaos. Substance abuse, criminal behavior, and toxic relationships were no longer fleeting episodes. They had become her reality. The bikers she surrounded herself with weren't just friends. They were her chosen family, a community bound together by a shared rejection of societal norms and a dangerous thirst for adrenaline. For Carla, this lifestyle offered an escape from the pain of her past, but it also dragged her further into a spiral of self-destruction. Among the most pivotal figures in her life was Daniel Garrett. Garrett was a man deeply entrenched in the biker subculture, someone who shared Carla's penchant for hard drugs and reckless living. Their connection was immediate but toxic, a relationship forged in addiction and fueled by mutual recklessness. Garrett wasn't just her partner. He was her co-conspirator in a life of lawlessness. Together, they pushed boundaries, blurring the lines between thrill-seeking and outright danger. Their drug-fueled bond only deepened their descent into darkness. Methamphetamine became a central force in their lives, warping their perceptions and amplifying their paranoia. It was within this haze of addiction that their paths crossed with Jerry Lynn Dean, a mechanic whose dealings with the couple turned contentious. What began as petty disputes over a motorcycle escalated into a boiling resentment. The tipping point came in June 1983. Carla and Garrett's resentment toward Dean had reached a breaking point, and their drug-fueled paranoia transformed simmering anger into a reckless plan for confrontation. On the night of the murders, the pair stormed into Jerry Dean's Houston apartment under the guise of reclaiming the motorcycle parts Carla believed were rightfully hers. Fueled by a dangerous cocktail of methamphetamine and rage, they weren't just seeking revenge. They were unleashing the chaos that had been building inside them for years. Inside the apartment, the situation spiraled out of control. Dean was attacked in his sleep, with Garrett delivering the first blows using a hammer. Carla joined in, seizing a pickaxe to strike him repeatedly. The scene was brutal, a manifestation of their unchecked anger and addiction-fueled detachment from reality. But the violence didn't stop there. Deborah Thornton, a woman who happened to be staying at the apartment that night, became an unexpected victim. She had no connection to the dispute. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. When she attempted to hide, Carla and Garrett found her. Despite her pleas for mercy, she was attacked with the same pickaxe. The brutality of the crime shocked even those familiar with the violent tendencies of the biker world. The aftermath of the murders was as disturbing as the crime itself. For Carla Faye Tucker and Daniel Garrett, the immediate response wasn't panic or remorse. It was a strange mixture of exhilaration and nonchalance. In the days following the brutal murders of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, Carla openly boasted about the events to friends. She described feeling a rush of pleasure during the attack, even going so far as to say she experienced a sense of satisfaction with each swing of the pickaxe. Their attempts to cover their tracks were minimal at best. There was no carefully orchestrated plan to erase evidence or avoid suspicion. Instead, they continued their drug-fueled lifestyle as though nothing had happened. This carelessness, combined with Carla's willingness to recount the events in graphic detail to those around her, set the stage for their inevitable downfall. The police investigation unfolded quickly. Law enforcement received tips from individuals within Carla and Daniel's circle, people who had heard their shocking confessions firsthand. Witness accounts, coupled with forensic evidence from the crime scene, painted a clear picture of what had transpired. The brutality of the attack, combined with the sheer recklessness of Carla and Daniel's behavior afterward, left little room for doubt. Within weeks, the pair was arrested and charged with capital murder. As Carla sat in custody, her earlier bravado began to wane. For the first time, she was forced to confront the full weight of her actions. But even then, her initial reactions were marked by defiance rather than remorse. She admitted to the murders without hesitation, describing them in stark, unflinching terms that shocked investigators. This brutal honesty, while undeniably powerful, only served to solidify the public's perception of her as a cold-blooded killer. Carla's reflections on the murders evolved over time, revealing a stark contrast between the person she was at the time of the crime and the person she would later become. In the early stages of her incarceration, she spoke of the murders with an unsettling detachment. The thrill she described feeling during the act was a chilling reminder of the depths to which her life had sunk. Yet, as the years passed, this narrative began to shift. She would later express profound regret for her actions, describing the murders as a turning point that forced her to confront the pain and chaos that had defined her life. Trial and convictions. As Carla awaited trial, the public's interest with her case continued to grow. The sheer brutality of the murders, combined with her candid admissions, made for a sensational story that captured headlines across the nation. The prosecution's portrayal of Carla as a remorseless killer and the defense's attempt to humanize her by highlighting the factors that had shaped her life became a factor. The prosecution leaned heavily on the details of the crime. They presented evidence of the attack's savagery, including the infamous pickaxe that had been used as a weapon. Witness testimonies from those who had heard Carla's confessions added further weight to their case, painting her as someone who not only committed a horrific act but reveled in it. Her own words, spoken with disturbing candor, became some of the most damning evidence against her. The defense faced an uphill battle. They argued that Carla's actions were the product of years of trauma, addiction, and toxic relationships. They emphasized her drug use at the time of the crime, suggesting that her state of mind was severely impaired. While these arguments provided important context, they did little to sway the jury in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Key moments from the trial highlighted the tension between these two narratives. The graphic descriptions of the murders left the courtroom stunned, while the defense's attempts to elicit sympathy for Carla were met with skepticism. In the end, Carla Faye Tucker was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The decision was met with a mix of relief and controversy. For some, it was a fitting punishment for a crime of such brutality. For others, it marked the beginning of a larger conversation about justice, redemption, and the human capacity for change. Carla Faye Tucker entered death row as a woman the world saw only through the lens of her brutal crimes. Convicted of the grisly murders of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, she was labeled a remorseless killer. But behind the prison walls, a transformation was quietly beginning, one that would ultimately redefine her legacy. At first, Carla's demeanor remained much the same. She was defiant, unapologetic, and resigned to her fate. The weight of a death sentence loomed over her, but she seemed almost indifferent, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of her punishment. For many, her lack of visible remorse reinforced their perception of her as irredeemable. But in the solitude of her cell, Carla began to reflect on the path that had brought her here. The drugs, the violence, the emptiness, it all seemed so distant, yet so deeply woven into her identity. One of the most profound shifts in Carla's journey was her embrace of Christianity. She credited her newfound faith as the catalyst for her transformation, describing how it gave her a sense of purpose and hope that she had never experienced before. Carla immersed herself in the teachings of the Bible, finding solace in its messages of forgiveness and redemption. For someone who had spent much of her life in chaos, the structure and discipline of faith were grounding. She began to pray daily, not just for herself, but for those she had wronged. Her prayers extended to the families of her victims, whom she hoped could one day find healing. Her faith wasn't confined to private moments. Carla became an active participant in prison ministries, offering counsel and support to fellow inmates. She wrote letters filled with words of encouragement, sharing her story in the hope that it might deter others from making the same mistakes she had. Carla's faith radiated outward, touching the lives of those around her. Guards, inmates, and even members of the public who learned of her story spoke of her sincerity. To many, she became a living testament to the power of redemption, a stark contrast to the person she had been at the time of her crimes. Carla also took on the role of a mentor within the prison. She offered support to other inmates, helping them navigate the emotional and spiritual challenges of incarceration. Through her actions, she fostered a sense of community in an environment defined by isolation and fear. Her remorse for her crimes was a constant theme in her writings and conversations. She didn't shy away from the reality of what she had done, nor did she attempt to excuse it. Instead, she acknowledged her actions with brutal honesty, emphasizing her desire to atone. Carla even reached out to the families of her victims, expressing her profound regret and praying for their healing. Though she knew she could never undo the pain she had caused, she hoped her efforts would bring some measure of comfort. As news of Carla's transformation spread, it sparked widespread public interest and debate. To her supporters, she was a symbol of the human capacity for change, a woman who had found redemption in the face of unimaginable odds. Religious leaders, including prominent figures like televangelist Pat Robertson, rallied to her defense, citing her faith and remorse as evidence that she deserved clemency. Even Pope John Paul II appealed on her behalf, asking for her death sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. But not everyone was convinced. To her critics, Carla's transformation was seen as a convenient attempt to escape justice. They argued that no amount of faith or good deeds could erase the horror of her crimes. For them, her newfound persona was overshadowed by the memory of the brutal murders she had committed. The last 24 hours. On February 1998, the 38-year-old convicted murderer was transferred from her cell at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. Her journey to the Huntsville unit, the oldest prison in Texas, was her final one. This facility, known for housing the state's execution chamber, had seen hundreds of executions since it opened in 1849. Carla was scheduled to face lethal injection the following day. Once at Huntsville, Carla was placed in a small holding cell near the execution chamber. She barely slept that night, clinging to a faint hope that some last-minute miracle might spare her life. She had spent years appealing her conviction, citing issues like ineffective legal representation and the influence of drugs on her actions, but her efforts had all been unsuccessful. Deep down, she seemed to understand that her time was running out. On the morning of February 3rd, Carla woke at 6 a.m. Unlike many prisoners on death row, she declined the standard breakfast, but nibbled on some crackers and sipped a soft drink. The morning hours were spent visiting with her family, including her father, sister, and husband, Dana Brown. Dana, a prison minister who had helped Carla find faith and later married her by proxy in 1995, was among her closest supporters. Their time together was bittersweet, separated by a screen that prevented any physical contact. Despite her efforts to remain composed, Carla was brought to tears during these emotional moments. Later in the day, Carla was moved to the death house, a cell located just 30 feet from the execution chamber. There, devastating news arrived. The U.S. Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had rejected her final legal appeals. It was clear that no reprieve would come. Even so, Carla maintained her faith and spent time with her spiritual advisor. For her last meal, she requested a banana, peaches, and a tossed salad with ranch dressing. However, she barely touched the food. By the late afternoon, the reality of what was to come settled over the prison. Carla declined the offer of a sedative, choosing instead to face her fate with clarity. Around 6 p.m., she took a shower and changed into a fresh white prison uniform and shoes. Her hair, still damp, was a reminder of her simple humanity in what was otherwise a highly scrutinized and somber event. At 6 6:05 p.m., Carla was escorted the short distance to the execution chamber. The atmosphere inside was heavy with emotion. 5 people she had chosen to be there: her sister, her husband, a close friend, her attorney, and Ronald Carlson, the brother of one of her victims, sat among the witnesses. Carlson, unlike many others, believed in Carla's transformation and opposed the death penalty. In a separate room, family members of her other victim, Deborah Thornton, observed the proceedings, their emotions a mixture of grief, anger, and a desire for closure. Meanwhile, outside the prison, over 1,200 people gathered. Some protested against the death penalty, while others supported it. The case had drawn significant public attention, partly because Carla was the first woman to face execution in Texas since 1863. Before the execution began, Carla was given the chance to speak. She turned first to the families of her victims, saying, "I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." Then she looked at her husband and softly said, "Baby, I love you." She also spoke to Ronald Carlson, asking him to hug his sister Peggy for her. Turning to the rest of her supporters, Carla expressed her gratitude, concluding with words of appreciation for the prison staff and a promise to wait for her loved ones in heaven. The sincerity in her tone moved many of those present, even as the reality of her crimes lingered in their minds. At 6:37 p.m., the execution process began. A series of drugs was administered. First, a sedative to render her unconscious, followed by a muscle relaxant to paralyze her, and finally, potassium chloride to stop her heart. Carla closed her eyes and began to hum softly, her voice faintly audible as she praised Jesus in her final moments. The room was silent except for the sound of her breathing slowing. Moments later, Carla coughed, groaned, and became still. At 6:45 p.m., she was pronounced dead. Witnesses noted that she appeared to die with a faint smile on her face, a sign of the peace she claimed to have found in her faith. Carla Faye Tucker's execution was historic. As the first woman executed in Texas in over 135 years, Carla Faye Tucker's life and death left a lasting impact, raising questions about the nature of redemption and the human capacity for change.